You're listening to the Be So Good podcast with Colin Pearce. Colin says you are 10 times better than you think. So why not be so good that they simply can't ignore you? Here's your host, Colin Pearce.
Hey there. In today's cancel culture, it's easy to offend anyone about anything. In fact, I might have even offended you by mentioning it. We don't live in a cancel culture, you might say. We're living in a time when put-downs, social and racial labelling, ridicule and stereotyping are being named and shamed. Well, good. However, the trouble for a gay blade like me, there I go again, gay blade, where do I get these from? Is that you can put your foot in it any time you like. In the 20s of the 20th century, Dale Carnegie wrote the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, and one of his postulates was if you want people to like you, don't start by kicking the beehive over. Well, it's all very well for him. I think he lived in a time when apiarists were as rare as rocking horse manure. There were less beehives. It feels to me that everyone these days owned about 5 of them. Our guest in this episode is Steve Simpson. He's really good at helping people manage change. One of the difficulties of getting organisations to change is making a way through a field, chock-a-block full of beehives, or what he calls UGRs. UGRs? Unwritten Ground Rules. Steve's the author of 2 books, including UGRs, Cracking the Corporate Culture Code. He's the co-author to a further 3 books, the latest being A Culture Turned. He's got a master's degree from the University of Alberta, and he speaks and consults to organisations all over the world. Steve, when did you start to unpack the idea of unwritten ground rules?
Colin, it was probably more than 30 years ago that I was at the time working in the education department in Western Australia, and I was in my late 20s, so it's more than 30 years ago, and I was bulletproof, as we are at that age. And I was invited by a regional manager in the education department to do a series of sessions on various topics. Now, I'm bulletproof. I didn't even look at the topics. I said yes, and I'd facilitate these sessions for school leadership teams. Now, one of the topics, as it turned out, was on culture. I'd previously done I'd done a master's degree and studied culture. And I went back to my books and I looked at what I'd read. And I thought to myself, there's no way I'm going to present this back to these leaders because it was so philosophical, so academic. So what I did, Colin, is I reflected on my time as a teacher, because I taught for around 4 to 5 years. And I reflected on my time as a teacher. And I don't know how I came up with the notion of UGRs, or unwritten ground rules, but I did. And I reflected on the unwritten ground rules that I'd encountered as a teacher. And when I presented this back to this group of school leaders, at the time, I don't know what told me this, but I just sensed I was actually onto something, because we were talking about stuff that normally doesn't get talked about.
I first heard you speaking about unwritten ground rules, and my brain said, whatever the word is, bazooka, eureka. But you had found it. I had that resonation as well. It's a terrific concept, but let's explain it some more. Is this breaking an unwritten ground rule? I was 20. My mate and I, we became teachers on the first day. We went to the school. We were asked to come at 8 o'clock for the first staff meeting. The staff were all lined up at this long table. There were 2 spare chairs left for us, so we both sat down and nothing was said. And there was a bit of shifting and a bit of nervousness. Thank you very much, Blobhead. And then, of course, just as we settled down and started to introduce ourselves to the bloke next to us, who was reluctant to say hello anyway, in walked the principal and the deputy and couldn't find their chairs. Nobody had said it's an unwritten ground rule that you leave that chair and that chair for the bosses, and no checkered shorts wearing newbie is going to come in and take that. You're going to die. And sure enough, we did. Was that an unwritten ground rule or just a cultural issue?
Oh, Colin, you've nailed it, because I had exactly the same experience as a teacher. I was at Narrogin Primary School, which is in southwest of Perth, And in my second year of teaching, I had exactly the same experience. I sat in a chair and got very strange looks. No sign, no advice, just very strange looks. And I later worked out exactly what you detected there. That is, that chair is reserved for the principal. But there's other UGRs that you picked up in that experience that you just explained, Colin. And one is to do with the level of joviality and humour that pervades the staff group, because they were quiet, they were reserved. Well, there's a UGR around that as well. So, there's lots to be detected in any given context.
When you walk into an organisation, do the unwritten ground rules leap out at you? Sometimes they do for me, or in a cultural issue, you walk in and you listen to I listen to the receptionist and think, crikey, these guys are doomed for hell. When I hear he or she say, sorry, he's out. Oh, I couldn't say. No, well, call back later. I think it's not his or her fault. It's the bozo at the top that hasn't ever rung himself to find out how bad it is. And so apparently there's an unwritten ground rule that you don't check your receptionist, or you don't check your service people. And I picked that up instantly. Is that the sort of thing you do when you walk into an organisation, take its pulse and see, there's UGRs everywhere here? Place is crawling.
Colin, it's worse than that because it's a curse. Prior to doing any, yeah, 100%, it's a curse. There is no off switch to this. And here's the funny thing, because I define UGRs, unwritten ground rules, as people's perceptions of this is the way we do things around here. For the vast majority of us, we tune into this, all of us, and by the way, not confined to work. Any collection of people in any context, in a church, in a sporting team, at work, there will be unwritten ground rules. It's a function of human beings being together. But for the vast majority of us, this happens at an unconscious level. So a new person, doesn't matter how senior they are, a new person to an organisation will normally be quieter when they start than they otherwise would be. Why? Unconsciously, they're tuning in to try and find out what the UGRs are. Why? In order that they can conform. So we're cursed, Colin, because, and everyone who's listening to this and viewing this is now cursed, because now it brings what normally happens at an unconscious level to a conscious level, and there's no off switch. Like pre-COVID, I used to sit in airport lounges and listen, eavesdrop on conversations, and my mind would go, that's a UGR, that's a UGR, and there was no stopping it. It's a curse, I'm telling you.
Give us some quick examples of UGRs where you might have put your foot in it, or where anybody else could. Like I walk around with constant shoe leather taste on my tongue. So, like I said in the introduction, kicking over beehives is so easy. The blooming things are everywhere. Have you noticed that?
Well, look, and we need to be fair here. UGRs are not always negative. I mean, that tends to be what we're drawn to. But if you're on a positive, dynamic team right now, by definition, it follows they're a positive, dynamic UGR. So it has to be the case. But look, I'll give you an example of the strength of a UGR from a real thing that happened to me. I was invited to present to the top 20 people, including the CEO, of an organisation on the topic of UGRs. So I go into their boardroom, again pre-COVID, I go into their boardroom, there's 20 people there, including the CEO, and I start presenting. After 15 minutes, I am gone, finished, shattered, could not continue after 15 minutes. Picture this, every single person's eyes in that room were fixed firmly on the table in front of them. I'm looking literally at 20 foreheads for 15 minutes. Now, we've all seen beginning speakers and trainers, they shake through nerves. I regressed to that because when you're looking at 20 foreheads for 15 minutes, it shatters your confidence. So I'm now, the shaking is starting to come out my voice. So I literally could not continue. And I stopped and I said, look, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to stop here. I said, and I took a couple of deep breaths to try and recompose myself. And I said this, I said, look, to be honest, I'm picking up a UGR in this room right now, and I admit I may be incorrect in interpreting it, but I'm seeing everyone's eyes fixed firmly on the table in front of them. I'm picking up a UGR which says around here, outsiders have got nothing to contribute. Well, that did the trick, Colin. A few eyes lifted then.
Yeah. Wow. So what's the difference between, UGRs and manners? I was younger. I was sent to Canberra. I stayed with one of the client's managers who happened to be Chinese and a well-to-do Chinese man with a beautiful home. And I thanked him and his wife, and we had a nice time. Came back, and then there was a complaint within the next few days about please don't send any more rude people like that Colin Pierce, because he didn't even bring us flowers or take us out to a meal. Now, I didn't know, had no idea. Maybe I should have. Was that an unwritten ground rule or just a cultural faux pas?
Yeah, well, see, prior to you sharing that story, which is really fascinating, I was going to share a view that manners are often culture based. So I've done a little bit of work in Asia, not much,
Yeah.
and I quickly learned that when you go into the, well, at least I was working with Chinese Malays in Malaysia, and I quickly learned there that when you're a guest in somebody's house, you take your shoes off before you enter the house. So that's manners to them, but that's a culture-based manner. But I would say that UGRs can override our normal way of behaving. And I'll give you an example of this. I was sharing to a group of CEOs who meet as a mastermind group, and this is an organised. This is organised. So this company has CEO mastermind groups organised all over the place, across Australia and elsewhere, and there are many of them. And they meet in groups of around 12 to 15. So I'm invited to present to one of these, and I'll get the areas mixed up, it doesn't matter. This was in the Gold Coast.
Yep.
And I'm presenting on UGRs. And soon after I introduce UGRs, one of the guys in the room, who's a CEO, puts his hand to his head like this, and he goes, "Oh, I don't believe it." And so I stopped. I said, "Did you want to share this with the rest of the group?" And he said, "Steve, we've recently moved location, and I was in a mastermind group in Brisbane, and there was a UGR in that group that said, around here, new members to our group are to be treated with the deepest suspicion until they prove us wrong." He said, "I was cold and aloof to new people joining our group." He says, "I've joined this new group, and the UGR is, around here, new members to our group are welcomed for the contribution they can bring until they prove us wrong." He says, "Here I am, almost physically giving these people a hug as they join our group." Now, there's the same guy whose behaviours are being dictated, who's intelligent, smart, senior, whose behaviours are being dictated by a group of people with whom he meets once a month. Dramatically different behaviour because of the UGRs within each of those groups. It's amazing.
Yeah, it is. A couple of other thoughts just ran through my mind. I was in Malaysia, KL, and I love babies. Absolutely love looking at babies, and my family's that embarrassed, but I've got to stop and talk to a baby. I think babies know something that, they've just come from some wonderful place. They just know stuff, and if you stand there long enough, something will run over you. Now, that's a lot of palaver, but there you go. I love looking at babies. I think they're absolutely stunning, and I usually say, "That's a lovely little bubby. Oh, you're lucky to have a bubby like that." So I'm going around KL saying to people, "Oh, can I see your bubby?" Guess what the local dialect word for pig is? Here I am in a Muslim culture saying to people, "What a lovely little pig you've got." And I fly back to say, "Don't laugh, it's not funny." I could have got somebody saying, "I kill you." I went to was pig meat, Muslim, wrong. Yeah, it just goes on. There are pitfalls everywhere, and I think I want to ask you before we get on to solving them. How do you deal with yourself when you discover you've kicked over a beehive? You've stepped on an unwritten ground rule, and now half the people in your group are saying, steer clear of this guy. Can you recover from a faux pas where you've really mucked one up?
Oh, absolutely. I think all of us can recover if we demonstrate that it was a naive and innocent error that we made, and that we're keen to address that. The ideal is not to kick over the beehive, to find out where the beehives are before you start walking, and that's again why most of us stay quieter when we join a new group, because we're sensing who the beehive owners are, where they're located, and where not to step. But look, I think the vast majority of people.
Is this a fair sign? You're in trouble.
Yeah, that or people nudging. Like, we've all been to meetings, and we've been those people where the new person says something in a meeting that they shouldn't have, because eyes might roll. One person sat next to the edge might nudge the next person and under their breath say, "Give them time." We've all seen those. We've seen those cues. We've seen them, and that's a very strong message. Don't do that again. And we think that's subtle, as the old timers at that meeting. We think that's subtle, but there's no way that's subtle. That's in the face of that new person so much that it's highly likely they won't do it again. So the cues for breaching accepted UGRs are normally very clear. We think they're subtle, but normally it's in the face of us. We know.
Okay, so once you discover a few UGRs, you've spent your life preparing people for change by pointing out the UGRs, the unwritten ground rules that have to be overcome or established. So maybe walk us through how you go about that, so that people who aren't going to make a profession of it, but can at least get through their families and their friends and their community workplace.
So we got a 5-step process, and the first step says forget about UGRs, because there's a more important consideration, and that is from an organisational point of view. Colin, I haven't had the courage to go into, because UGRs exist in families. Any collection of people will have UGRs. I haven't had the courage to go into the UGRs associated with families. I've worked in the space of the workplace, okay? But I think, again, I haven't had the courage to go there, but I think these some of the things I'm going to talk about now might even have application in a family context. But from a workplace context, the first step is to say, what culture do we need to have in place for us to truly be successful while making it a great place to work? We need clarity and commitment to an aspirational culture, not for the sake of being soft and flowery, but in the interest of us being truly successful while also making it a great place to work. What does our culture need to look and feel like? That's the first step. We need clarity around that. In the absence of fighting for, the leaders in particular, fighting for this aspirational culture, what are they fighting for? So that's the first step.
We were listening to a couple of people over the last few episodes, and they've talked about begin with a plan, and I think begin with the end in view from Dr. Covey is still helpful advice today. You have to have a picture of what it wants to look like. While you were speaking, I was distracted by my own recollection of an organisation that said, the directors had said, we will only work with people who are fun. Our business will be about fun, finance, and I think fineness, or we will do lovely work. But the CEO was a bully. He'd scream if anybody left their coffee cup on the counter or on the sink, if they didn't put their dishes in the dishwasher. And although it was all supposed to be fun, he wasn't. And sometimes you can have this great plan, but it doesn't sink through. You've confronted that, I'm sure.
Well, that's where the next step of our 5-step process.
He's good, folks. He leads them in. Go on.
Well, we've got to hit the rubber's got to hit the road, right? Because we say don't have value statements just for the sake of having values, because often they're conceived as completely separate from any serious planning process by consideration of a question like, oh, by the way, what do we want our values to be? I mean, they're often, we've got to reframe our thinking to say that our culture is the foundation stone upon which everything sits. And your example just now, Colin, is a classic example of that. You know, we've got these flowery values, fun, finance and something else, but, you know, people are treated with disrespect. So how can we have fun if that's the context? So we've got to get serious about genuinely what do we need our culture to be. But then the second step is now finding out what the UGRs are in relation to that aspirational culture. So let's just presume that a cultural aspect of our culture that we really want to pursue is teamwork. How would people in an organisation complete this sentence anonymously? Around here when you need help, or around here when it comes to dealing with people from other work areas. If we're fighting for innovation and constant improvement, how would people in an organisation complete this sentence? Around here when someone comes up with a new idea. If we're fighting for genuine respect across an organisation, how would people complete this sentence? Around here, people are treated. So, Colin, I hope you can see from that we can find out what the current UGRs are simply by getting people to complete the sentence to what we call lead-in sentences. And more often than not, in fact, almost in every case, it is a revelation, what we unearth.
Is it really?
So we're either serious about this, it's a revelation. It is staggeringly powerful for leaders and staff to see the outcomes from simply getting people to complete these sentences. And remember, linked back to the culture that we need in place for us to truly be successful while making this a great place to work. It's a revelation.
What sort of revelation can you recall? It's a bit hard to drop it on you right now, but does something come to mind?
Well, often the negativity that is below the surface. So we've done a lot of research. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. We've done a lot of research, and we've discovered, almost without exception, that leaders see their culture more positively than middle managers, who in turn see their culture more positively than non-managers. So when we surface this stuff, it is often a genuine surprise for people, for leaders, about the extent to which people are unhappy in the workplace. And this has significant and substantial implications. So I'll give you an example. Around here, when someone comes up with a new idea, we've often included that in what we call a UGR's stock take, which again, we craft this uniquely to the aspirational culture for that organisation. But we'll often include around here when someone comes up with a new idea. It's not uncommon for someone to write something like this, Colin. Around here when someone comes up with a new idea, bosses pinch the good ideas and use them as their own. Now, that's that's amusing to hear that. But think about the consequences of that UGR. If that's my UGR, I'm at a meeting, the boss or somebody else says, any ideas on how we can improve here? I've got plenty of ideas, but my UGR is going to cause me to stay silent. There's no way I'm going to share that because of my UGR. So it's got dramatic impact on people's performance, their desire to go above and beyond or not. This has enormous ramifications, enormous.
Yeah, so you discover this in your UGR uncovery.
100%. Then we get people involved. So you see, here's my view. If there is a silver bullet when it comes to improving cultures or indeed transforming cultures, if there is a silver bullet, and there probably isn't, but if there is, I think it's the notion of shared ownership. I think too many staff take a cop-out position and point upwards and say, if only they'd fix things up, we'd be okay. So what we do with the outcomes from this UGR stock take is we share the results. First with leaders, that they deserve the right to see the results first. But then our approach is to say, let's share this with everyone in the organisation. Teach them about UGRs, share the results, but most importantly, get them involved in saying, what can we do to make improvements to any areas of concern from this, with particular emphasis on what each of us as individuals might be able to do differently. We've got to encourage this shared ownership. I think I've learned there are a lot of people who are unhappy in the workplace. The vast, and I
You
include
think so?
leaders here, there's a lot. And the vast majority of those people do not want it to be that way. They've merely given up hope of it being any different. So we need a circuit breaker, and introducing people to UGRs and going through this sort of process can often be that circuit breaker. The third step is actually teaching people about UGRs, and we can do this as part of that process of sharing the results from collecting the current UGRs. And when we get people to complete the sentence, that's called a UGRs stock take. So we're finding out what the current UGRs are. Remember, associated with the most important aspects of our culture. So we craft these lead-in sentences to link back to the most important aspects of our culture. We teach people, the third step is teaching people about UGRs. Many people are subscribing to negative UGRs, but doing so unconsciously. Why? Because that's why we've always done it. And by the way, that's what's tolerated. So in the circumstance you described, Colin, that behaviour was tolerated. So we've got to put a circuit breaker in this, and UGRs can be that circuit breaker. I mean, there's other options, but we've got to try and put a circuit breaker in this. So the third step is and often I don't know if the word often is the right word. Sometimes UGRs is a revelation for people because they realise they've been subscribing to negative UGRs, but they've been doing that unconsciously. And maybe that was the case in this example you gave, Colin, that those people realised that, wow, it's just a UGR that I've been subscribing to for 30 years or more, and it was never brought to a level of consciousness that made me realise what I'm actually doing,
Yeah. I love those moments. If the organisation is primed and ready, it's a wonderful thing to see, isn't it? When people snap open and say, "Oh, I had no idea. I get it," and they've been living in their own underground as well as their unwritten ground rules. Do you have a list of successes that spring to mind? Some breakthrough stories?
Well, one of my favourites is Kmart because I don't know if people remember this, but Kmart had literally lost money for 10 years in a row, literally. In Australian discount department stores, that world, they were bottom of the list. They'd lost money. They had an awful toxic culture. Guy Russo, Wesfarmers purchased Kmart and put in a new leadership team headed up by Guy Russo, the best leader I've ever met. And he loved UGRs, and so they used UGRs as the vehicle to understand and improve the culture across Kmart. Now, that's not solely responsible for the transformation of Kmart, which is now by a long stretch Australia's leading retailer, but it was one of the four major platforms, and it was an awful culture. Stores would ring into head office, as it was then called. Words matter. They now call it support office, but they would ring into head office, and the phones would ring out. People would walk past ringing phones. There was internal warfare. It was bad, and UGRs was the vehicle to understand and improve the culture there, and that was. I mean, I don't know if any of you people who are watching this have been to a Kmart store recently, but they're legendary now, aren't they? So
Yes.
yeah.
I was surprised the other day to find somebody who appeared to be quite new. She was young, and I asked her where the somethings were, and she said, "Come on, I'll show you." And I thought, hello, they've either hired a person with a great social IQ or a retail IQ, or they've trained it in. And I got the feeling that as I walked around the store, it's near me, a lot of them do it. So I guessed that it's part of that culture. Moving over to you, if you're scratching your head in front of the automatic exit teller machine, what do you call it? The scanner, saying, "A bit of trouble there, aren't you?" To which you can say, "Yeah, actually, blooming thing." And say, "Yeah, let me do it." And they've got that lovely tone about them, which is as rare as rocking horse manure in retail universally, isn't it?
Well, my view is that the vast majority of people, including leaders, including staff, want to be part of a positive, dynamic, productive culture.
Yeah.
I think most of us have an innate desire to be part of that team. But so many people have given up hope of it being any different to what it currently is. And I think that's what happened to Kmart. We actually gave people hope, led by a brilliant leader. Guy Russo is the best leader I've ever met. And, now it's often UGRs are used to pull people back or pull them down. Comments like "give them time" are often directed at new people who come in starry-eyed and positive. Give them time. They're being dragged down, and they will get dragged down after time. But we can flip this around. I think it's got to a point in Kmart where they're so proud of the culture that they have that it works in reverse. And I'd guess that a person who came in and talked negatively about customers, for example, would be pulled into line and be told in no uncertain terms, hang on, that's not the way we do things around here. Customers are really important. Pull your socks up, So it's an exciting prospect, I think, to be characterised by a positive, productive, dynamic culture, which is by definition positive UGRs.
We're about to wind up, but I'm tempted to ask you about Guy Russo. You've mentioned him twice as the best leader you've ever met. What was so hot about Guy Russo?
I can give you a couple of examples. So I'll give you one example, Colin. I organised to meet with him. We both live in Melbourne, and he said, "Yeah, let's have a meeting in Melbourne." And so he said, "Look, I've got a meeting prior to us meeting in a location that's not in the Kmart office. It's in the city of Melbourne." So I was waiting outside of this city office for Guy to complete his meeting, and he comes out, and we did our pleasantries. "How's it going, Guy?" I said, "So how's business?" as we're walking towards a coffee shop, and Guy turned to me and he said, "Steve, I don't want to talk about work. How's the family?" Now, that's the leader of one of the major discount department stores in Australia. And that's his instant response. And that's Guy. I did a series of sessions for the Kmart leaders right across Australia and New Zealand, and Guy attended them all. And during the morning tea break, I get people to reflect on this. I say, what are leaders most often doing during a break in a session which is run by me, an outsider, but all the staff are from the one organisation? What are the senior leaders most often doing? Well, they're either on their phone or talking to each other. Not Guy. Guy was amongst the troops, could not be seen, talking to the troops. And that's the way he's wired. He just has a desire to know and learn about other people, mostly those who aren't leaders. That's the way I was wired. So people pick up on this very, very quickly. And there's a strong UGR that says our leader genuinely cares. And I don't think there's too many organisations that have that UGR in place. And I don't know if you have to be wired that way, but certainly Guy was wired that way. So UGRs and Guy fitted together perfectly because he models so many positive UGRs. And, what a remarkable turnaround that story is of Kmart.
Fantastic. You're right. I often mostly think of UGRs as the negative ones, but there are, if you're going to go back to the garden or apiarist analogy, there are also lovely rose bushes in the garden, which you can approach and enjoy, breathe in, and thoroughly use that as a positive experience for yourself if you see it that way. I guess if you walk around looking for beehives to boot over, they're easy. Don't need big feet either. Hey, it's been fantastic talking to you, and I'm so glad you dropped in. Thank you very much. We've been listening to the one and only Steve Simpson. Tell us where we can find you. You've got a funny URL, UGRs. Go on.
Yeah, well, it'll come as a surprise to everyone that you can get me. Well, the website is UGRs.net, and my email steve@UGRs.net. Been a treat, Colin.
And what?
It's been a treat to connect with you.
Yeah, it has been a treat. And I look forward to catching up with you again soon. Thanks, Steve. Cheers.
Thanks, Colin.
You've been listening to Be So Good with Colin Pierce. Please share the link with someone who needs to be reminded that they are 10 times better than they think. For more episodes, check out the playlist at colinpierce.com/podcast. And don't forget to drop a review in iTunes. It really does make a difference.